If you have your Bibles and would like to join me in Luke chapter 10, Luke chapter 10 is where we'll focus our attention this morning in our time together. It was almost a year ago. September 19th will be a year that my son Drake was born. So we're nearing that day. It's an exciting time at our house and in our family. But over the course of the last year, I've learned a lot of things, right? As a first-time parent, there have been a lot of lessons that have come. And there were some things that just naturally happened. Like, one of the first weeks that Drake was born, I had to run to the store and I was wearing some Nike crew socks. My shirt and shorts didn't match, and I think I just put on some Crocs, and Heidi was like, "You're going to the store like that?" And I was like, I'm a dad now. It doesn't matter. It's like I can wear whatever I want because I'm a dad. I don't have to match or, look nice because I'm a dad. And then there's just other things that naturally happen to you when you become a dad that don't happen when you're not. And for some reason, I don't know why this happened every night for a couple of weeks, but Heidi would come in and say, "Why are you watching the news?" I'm like, I don't know. I'm a dad now. It's like, that's what you do. You just watch the news when you get old. I don't know. So I just felt like that was something I had to do. And it progressed. Because now not only do I watch the news, but I have a news app on my phone. And so I get notifications every time some story comes up that I need to read. And one of the things I guess that I've always been interested in are true crime or any type of documentaries or anything like that. I've always just been interested in stories. And I got a notification some time ago about a cold case that had been reopened because some details that emerged as a result of someone coming forward. And so I went down the rabbit hole of reading this story and reading all about the cold case and what happened years ago. And there was a term in the story that I was unfamiliar with. The term was Kitty Genovese syndrome. And they referenced that several times throughout the article. And I was like, well, I'm not sure what that is. So I guess I need to figure out what that is. Kitty Genovese syndrome. And so I Googled it and I found that in March of 1964, there was a trial in which case Kitty Genovese had been brutally murdered by a man named Winston Moseley. And what happened, Mr. Moseley was standing outside the door of Kitty Genovese, who he had mapped her habits and her patterns over a course of several months. She had gotten off of her shift at 2 a.m. in the morning. She was trying to go into her apartment, and Mr. Moseley was standing in between her and her car. The door in her car. They say it was some 100 feet from where she parked her red vehicle to the door of her apartment. And as she got near to the man, she started to suspect something wasn't right. She didn't recognize him. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. There was a police call box on the outside of her apartment. So she diverted toward the police call box, was going there instead of her apartment. And before she could get to the call box to call the police, Mr. Moseley jumped on her and stabbed her more than 20 times. Now, she was screaming while all of this was happening. She was screaming, I'm being stabbed, I'm being attacked. And she was literally wailing, trying to get the attention of the people in the apartment complex. There were lights that came on. In fact, one man stepped out on the balcony and said, "Hey, leave her alone, leave her alone." And Mr. Moseley did leave for a short time enough for Miss Genovese to stumble into the door of her apartment. But Mr. Moseley circled back around a few minutes later to finish the job. She was stabbed more than 40 times. No one ever even came to her apartment until the next morning, when finally a neighbor called and said that he thought something bad had happened to his neighbor, so he wanted a welfare check. The police responded the next morning and found Miss Genovese dead, having been stabbed more than 40 times. Detectives started doing a little bit of work around the apartment complex, trying to survey the events of the killing and what happened, trying to gather information. And at the conclusion of their investigation, there were 38 people that had witnessed Miss Genovese being stabbed that night. 38 people, either with their own eyes, saw her trying to stumble to her apartment bleeding. They saw the attacker on her in the front yard, or they heard her desperate plea for help as she screamed that she was being attacked. 38 people heard or saw what was happening to her out in the yard that day. They asked the man who finally called why he waited till the next morning. They said, "Why did you wait?" And he said, "Well, I wasn't even going to call, but then I was urged by my friend that I probably should do the right thing and call." And the detectives asked him, this was in the court case, "Why did you wait? Why did you wait till the next morning? Why didn't you call?" And to no surprise, his answer was, "I didn't want to get involved." Mr. Mosley, the killer, spoke up and said, "It's no surprise. They never do. No one ever wants to get involved." From that court case came what we know as the Kitty Genovese syndrome. And they described the Kitty Genovese syndrome as the tragedy of not wanting to be involved. That there's a tendency of humans that they have in their heart to say, "You know what, I just don't want to be involved. I have my own things to worry about. I have things that I need to deal with. It's really not my circus, so I'm not going to bother with it. I have enough things going on." The tragedy of not being involved is what they coined the term, the Kitty Genovese syndrome. And I think it stands to reason that humans are often too self-absorbed, that they're often too self-aware, or maybe that they're just indifferent or scared or busy to help people that are hurting all around us. Now, we're not talking about people that have been stabbed 40 times, but genuine needs of people that we encounter all of the time, that oftentimes we're just too busy, too indifferent, too scared to be involved. With that, we turn our attention to Luke chapter 10. We turn our attention to Luke chapter 10. And before we start reading in Luke chapter 10, I want to add an interesting side note to the story of the trial of Winston Moseley, the guy who killed Miss Genovese. As they were trying Mr. Moseley, there was a point that was raised by one of the lawyers who said, "You notice who is not here being tried for this murder?" Everyone was a little bit confused. They didn't understand what he was saying. He said, "Look around. You notice who's not here." He says, "None of the 38 people are here." He says, "None of the 38 people that heard or saw what was happening to Miss Genovese, they're not here in this courtroom." Because what law had they broken, right? I mean, what law had they broken? They had not necessarily done anything wrong. None of the 38 people were charged with anything because they had not done anything wrong. And the truth is, there are plenty of laws that punish people for doing wrong. There are laws that exist all the time to punish people for doing wrong, but how do you punish someone for not doing what was right? What was right would have been to call and to help, to jump to her aid, to do something in that moment. But how do you punish them for not doing what was right? It's like this, like if a kid falls into the river, no one can punish you if you don't do that. There's not a law that says you have to jump in the river, right? But I mean, all of us would, or at least we think we would, because that's the right thing to do. You would jump in and do that because that's the right thing to do. No one can compel you to speak to maybe the person in your workplace that doesn't speak English. No one can compel you to go speak to that person and try to establish a relationship with them. Or maybe they're different with you. Maybe they look different than you, or maybe they have different political views than you. No one can compel you to do that. But the right thing to do is to go talk to them. And you can't be punished if you don't, because it's not wrong. I mean, you don't have to do that. No one says you do, but no one can compel you to do it. Did you know that no one can require you to go visit someone from your congregation here at Jonesboro that's sick? No one can require you to do that, I guess. No one can require you to maybe take a dish to them if they've had surgery. No one can require you to make a phone call. I mean, there's not a law or a rule that says you have to do it, but it's the right thing to do. And for whatever reason, there's this tendency in all of our hearts to just not do it. Like, we just don't want to get involved in other people's lives. We don't want to help people that are needy. And all of that in mind leads me to what happens in Luke chapter 10 when there's an individual, a lawyer. In fact, some translations say an expert of the law, who has a conversation with Jesus. We've said this week that we're going to look at encounters that people have where they come face to face with Jesus. And they have one of two options. Number one, they can leave the same way they did when they encountered him. That they can come to Jesus, they can ask him questions, they can hear what he has to say, and they decide for whatever reason or another, they don't want any part of what Jesus has to offer. Or it just might be the case that they're individuals that encounter Jesus, whether by happenstance, at least in their minds, by happenstance, or whether they seek him out and they leave changed because of what Jesus has to offer. Let's look at Luke 10 in terms of what we've just learned about the Kitty Genovese syndrome and the encounter that this man has with Jesus Christ. By the way, I meant to mention to you an encounter or an excerpt from President George W. Bush's inaugural speech, his first time serving as our president. He said in his inauguration speech that there were a lot of people that don't know the pain of poverty. And he was addressing, obviously, a group of people that were wearing nice suits and looked nice. And he was like, most of you don't know the pain of poverty. And he was like, I don't know the pain of poverty either. But I can make a promise to this nation that when we see someone laying on the side of the road on the way to Jericho, we won't pass them by. And I read that and I was like, George W. Bush got that from Luke 10. Like he had something figured out. And his message to the American people was, we're going to help. Like, I'm not just going to sit and not get involved with people that help. That's what I'm going to pride myself on, is helping people that need help. Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan. I know you've heard it many times, but man, it's a story that pricks our hearts if we read it with eyes that are ready to be changed. Look with me at verse 25. An expert in the law stood up to test Jesus, saying, Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And that happens a lot. These experts of the law always want to question Jesus and try to trap him, right? That's what they're doing. Verse 26, what is it that's written in the law, he asked, and how do you read it? And Jesus said, or rather the young man says, love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you have answered correctly. He told him, you do this and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, verse 29, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And from this point forward, in verse number 30, Jesus takes up the question and begins to tell the parable or the story of the Good Samaritan that you and I have read so many times before. But before we actually look at the parable, let's consider in verses 25 through 29 the question, all right? That's our first area of study, the question that the expert of the law asked to Jesus. And in my mind, I keep replaying this Kitty Genovese story, by the way. I have thought about it so many times ever since I read it. I've shared it with the kids at school. I teach Bible every day at Mars Hill Bible School in Florence, and I shared it with them, and it was blowing their minds that 38 people saw this happen and nobody said anything. And I asked them the question. I was like, well, what if you were 39? What would you have done? Would you have helped, or would you have not done anything because no one else was doing anything? And so you didn't want to be the one who did it, because that's big with high school students. If everyone else is not doing it, they're not going to do it either, right? But if everyone else is doing it, then they'll do it. And so if 38 people said, I'm not going to help, well, guess what? 39 wasn't going to either. Okay, so what have I done? If I was there, would I have been the 39th person that didn't say anything, or would I have been the one person that did? And while you're answering that question in your own mind, turn to this conversation that Jesus has with the lawyer and consider the question, right? Verse 25, it starts with an expert in the law, or some of your Bibles might just say a lawyer asked Jesus a question. Either way, it tells us something about the guy who encounters Jesus, whether your Bible reads an expert in the law, verse 25, or a lawyer, right? It tells us something about the personality and the education of this individual who encounters Jesus. And the fact of the matter was, a lawyer in Jesus's day was not a trial lawyer or a court case lawyer like what you and I would think of today. My brother's in law school in New Orleans. My brother Jacob is. And what he's aspiring to be is not what Jesus would have encountered in Luke 10 and verse 25. Rather, when we speak of an expert in the law or a lawyer in the New Testament, we're talking about individuals that were trained in the law of God. And their responsibility would have been to share and to educate people with the law of God. Literally, they were professional law studiers and law teachers. Not law as in Roman law, laws of justice, laws of right, but God's law. That's what they did. They gave their attention to that. They gave their life to knowing God's law. And so this guy encounters Jesus, who is gifted in asking or answering the question that he asked Jesus himself. And by the way, the religious leaders probably set him up to it, because in verse 25 it says that he came to him to trap Jesus. And so it really wasn't all that sincere anyway. And I know that it wasn't sincere because of other details that unfold in the text. But either way, you have a guy that knew the answer to the question that he asked. I mean, he knew it. He knew it because he trained himself in the law. But nonetheless, he asked a question that everybody should ask. What should I do to inherit eternal life? Everyone wants to know in some way, shape, or form the answer to that question, right? In the bottom of our heart somewhere, there's part of us that wonders, how can I go to heaven? That's the most important thing, right? All of us want to know it, and if you don't, I hope you do by the end of the week. How can I go to heaven, right? And Jesus, to the lawyer's displeasure, answers a question with a question. Do y'all hate when people do that? I do, right? You ask a deep question, a question that you're really wanting the answer to, and then the person turns around and asks you a question. That makes me so mad. And to the lawyer's displeasure, that's what Jesus did. The lawyer asked him, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Verse 25. And Jesus says, in essence, you know the law. I mean, why are you asking me the question that you should know the answer to, because you're trained in the law? You help people answer this same question. So why are you asking me what I say the law says? Because you, in fact, know the answer to the question. And the lawyer says, oh yeah, you're right. The law says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I know that the lawyer knows the law because he didn't just pull that out of his hat. That's a direct quotation of Deuteronomy chapter 19 and Leviticus I got those mixed up. Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19. Direct quotation. And so it's not like he just said, well, I'm going to guess and say, love the Lord your God with all your heart. No, he knew that. He had studied the law, and he had helped other people know that very same thing. And so when Jesus speaks to him and asks him that question, Jesus knew that he knew the answer to what he was asking. He knew it was a trap. That tells you the insincerity of the approach of the man that came to Jesus. He had no interest in actually learning what he could do to go to heaven. He was simply there to catch Jesus in a trap. And Jesus tells him, you know the answer to the question that you asked. But where Jesus throws the curveball to the guy is in verse number 28, when he says, do this and you will live. As if to say, you haven't been doing what you said is the answer to the law. You want to know how to inherit eternal life? The guy says, I know. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Maybe the guy was doing that, because in verse number 30, the parable is not about loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The guy probably, if he asked him, sir, lawyer, do you love God with all your heart? He'd say, yes, I love God with all my heart. But obviously it's the loving the neighbor part that he had a problem with, because that's what Jesus dives into in verse 30 and following about how you love your neighbor, which by extension has to do with how you love God. Those two things are related. But either way, the guy says, I love the Lord, my God, with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is just like it, to love your neighbor. And Jesus says, okay, but do that. Do that and you'll live. Do that and you'll have the answer to the question. Some people say Jesus was teaching salvation by works, right? Because all he says is do that. Jesus wasn't teaching that at all. Jesus wasn't saying this is all you have to do. He's just saying this is a good start. You haven't done it and you need to start doing it. And so now the guy's sweating bullets, right? Because Jesus has made him think about what he's not doing in his life. Maybe he regrets ever volunteering to be the guy to go test Jesus. Maybe he's thinking, what have I done? It's like raising your hand to ask a question in class, and then the teacher makes you look like a fool when you ask the question. That's what this guy's done. He's gone to ask the professor a question, and Jesus makes him look like a fool by his answer. He turned the guy literally into a pretzel with like 20 words. The guy he doesn't know what to do now, because Jesus has gotten him into a predicament. And I know that because look at verse 29. It says the lawyer wants to justify himself. Now he's like trying to backtrack because I've messed up. I've gotten myself into this predicament. I came to trap Jesus, and guess what? The lawyer's the one trapped. Now Jesus trapped him because he thinks, oh, I've got Jesus right where I want him. And Jesus says, no, you don't understand. You're talking to Jesus, the one who knows everything. Let me ask you a question. And the guy gets himself in a predicament because he knows he's not right with God. Maybe the guy did love God. Maybe he really did. If you asked him, lawyer, do you love God? He would say, yes, I love God. But obviously he has a problem with the loving my neighbor. And he asked this question in verse number 29. And who is my neighbor? Do you see that question? That's a big one. That's a pivotal part of understanding Luke chapter 10 and the answer that Jesus gives. When he asks the question, who is my neighbor? It tells me again that this man who approached Jesus is not sincere in his question of asking, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Because by asking, tell me who you have to love, or tell me who I have to love. What that guy's really saying is, tell me who I don't have to love. He's like, Jesus, who is my neighbor? And he wants Jesus to tell him a specific group of people so that everyone who's not that kind of person, he doesn't have to worry about. And that was a problem of the Pharisees. They only loved the Pharisees. If you weren't a Pharisee, they didn't like you. And so here's this man saying, tell me who I don't have to love. In verse 29, when he asked Jesus the question, who is it that I have to love? He wanted a loophole, a legal limit, basically, to who it was he would have to give his time and his passion to. And Jesus explodes the loophole and literally blows the mind of this guy. And he does so by telling a story, a parable. So we shift our attention then to area of study number 2, the parable. Area number 1 was the question, what should I do to inherit eternal life, and who is my neighbor? Now we shift our attention to the parable that we know very well. Verse 30, Jesus takes up the question, who is my neighbor? And says, well, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell in the hands of thieves or robbers, and they stripped him, beat him up, fled, and left him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the road. When he saw him, he passed by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite, when he arrived at the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But, verse 33, a Samaritan, for those of you who were here in class, that's a big deal, right? John 4, the woman at the well, Jew and Samaritan. A Samaritan, verse 33, on his journey came up to him, and when he saw the man, had compassion. He went over and bandaged his wounds, poured on him oil and wine, put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I'll pay you back for any extra that he spends. Which of these 3, Jesus says, verse 36, do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of thieves? And the man says in verse 37, the one who showed mercy to him. And Jesus said to him, go and do the same. Now, even though we call this a parable, and even though Luke declares it a parable, I sometimes have a problem or a struggle, I guess, in my own way of believing whether or not this was a real thing. Like, I feel like this could have been a real story, like something that actually happened. And there's no details that suggest that it wasn't a real story. But either way, if it is something that Jesus just used to illustrate the message to the man, or if there was a real life occasion that Jesus was describing, it begins with a certain man in verse number 30. A certain man was going down from Jerusalem. That leads me to believe that this certain man was a Jew, which is why this story is so amazing, because the one person that stops to help is a Samaritan, and Jews and Samaritans are arch enemies. Literally, Jews believe Samaritans are the scum of the earth. And so it's important then to pay attention to the fact that this certain man was leaving Jerusalem, which would have been a familiar place to a Jew. All right, so here you have the possibility of a Jew leaving Jerusalem on his way, and he falls in the hands of robbers or thieves that beat him up and leave him for dead. I think that it's also interesting that it really actually doesn't matter if it's a Jew. Like, I think it's a Jew because he was leaving Jerusalem, and it makes the fact that a Samaritan helped him even better. But I think that Jesus left out the nationality on purpose. Like, Jesus doesn't tell us the background of this man. He doesn't tell us what language he speaks. He doesn't tell us what color he is. He doesn't tell us how much money he has. He doesn't tell us if he has any education. He just says a man needed help. That's all he says. A man is laying on the side of the road needing help. And you don't need any more details than that. The priest didn't need it. The Levite didn't need it. The Samaritan didn't need it. All that they knew was there was a man on the side of the road that needs help. Now, geography is helpful too. In John 4, we talked about it, that there were 3 main regions. There's Galilee in the north, Samaria in the middle, and Judea in the south. Jerusalem, it was a big capital in the place of Galilee, right? And so you have this section of land, basically, that geographically speaking was elevated. It was really high up. And so Jerusalem was situated on a hill. And so when we read that they were going down from Jerusalem, it was sort of a mountainous pass from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it was a place where it was barren and waste. In fact, it's called the Bloody Way because there was nobody to keep eyes on anyone traveling. If you went from Jerusalem to Jericho on the Bloody Way, you're by yourself. And people knew that. So it was a perfect place where robbers could leap on the people. They could prey on innocent people, prey on people that had no protection, right? It was a place that was conducive to being robbed. You knew that if you went from Jerusalem to Jericho this way through the mountain pass, that you run the risk of being robbed. And so it was with this man. You see then that this guy leaves Jerusalem. We don't know who he is, presumably a Jew, but we're not sure, and it doesn't matter. It was a man who left Jerusalem going to Jericho. He was on his way, fell into the hands of robbers, verse 30. And I want you to notice the first two people that encounter him, verse 31 and verse 32. A priest, verse 31, happened to be going down the road, saw him, passed by on the other side. In the same way, verse 32, a Levite, when he arrived at the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now we pause right there and we consider a couple of things. And I think it's important for us to think about this because if you consider the function of a priest and the function of a Levite, then you understand from your Old Testament studies that these were highly respected religious people. You could argue that these were quote unquote Christians. Do you understand? These were the good people. If there was anybody that should have helped, that the world would have thought would have helped, it would have been the priest and the Levite. Are you following my drift? The people that the world thinks should help the one who is hurt and in need are the Christians. And they don't do anything. They pass by on the other side. They look at the guy who's hurting and for whatever reason decide, I can't stop. I'm a religious leader. I've got too many things to do. I've got another job to do. I've got something that's going on. Something I've got to take care of. I can't stop. I don't know why. I have no idea why the priest and the Levite didn't stop. I don't know why they didn't do it, and perhaps it doesn't matter because Jesus doesn't say. But I do know this. I knew that just like the priest and the Levite, I can come up with my own excuses. And I would venture to say, after not really knowing the Jonesboro congregation very well, but having been around a lot of churches and a lot of Christians, that you too can come up with your own excuses. It's a problem. It's a tendency. That's why there's a whole study that's been put out since 1964 where there is ample evidence from psychologists and scientists alike that say the tendency of the human heart is to not help. Like that's what we gravitate toward, is to not get involved, to make excuses so we don't have to help people who are in need. That's the tendency of the human heart. We all have our excuses, but you know what an excuse is, right? I've heard it said that an excuse is the skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. I started to think about all of the excuses sometimes that we give that maybe these men could have said. And I want you to think about the priest and the Levite, two religious individuals. A priest, the Latin word for priest is a bridge builder. Literally, that was his job. He built bridges between the people and God. If the people wanted to talk to God under the old covenant, who did they have to go through? They had to go through the priest. He was the only one that could talk to God. The Levites in the Old Testament, they were the priestly tribe. Every priest in the Old Testament was from the tribe of Levi. Not every Levite was a priest, but they had priestly duties. They were the religious group. Okay? They were the Christians that were supposed to help. And so the Bible doesn't say why they didn't, but I would like to speculate for a second. And I'm speculating on the basis of my own excuses, the excuses that I've heard others give, and perhaps some of the excuses that you've given too for why these men might have passed by on the other side. Perhaps the priest and the Levite looked at the man who was in need and they said, I'm already late. I'm already late, or I'm too busy to stop, so I can't help them because I have some things going on and I'm too busy to help. Have you ever heard anybody say that? Have you ever heard anybody or known anybody to think, I can't help somebody in need? And maybe we're not even talking about somebody who needs money. Maybe we're not talking about somebody who has maybe we're just talking about somebody who's lost in sin that has a need, but I can't help them because I'm too busy. I have too many things going on in my life. Maybe someone says something like, well, I don't know them. I mean, maybe the priest and the Levite said, well, Yeah, I don't know him. I'm not helping him. So I'm going to just keep on going toward Jericho because I don't know. Maybe somebody that knows him will come along and do it. Maybe we don't help people because of that. It's like, I don't know them, so I can't help them. Maybe the excuse we would give is, well, maybe it's a trap. This guy got beat up by the robbers, and maybe they left him there. And so if I go over and help him, then I might get beat up too. So I'm not going to do it. I can't help him because I might have a problem too. It might hurt me a little bit if I help those people. Have you ever heard that? Maybe we think, well, I'm not qualified. You look at all the wounds on the guy and you say, well, I'm not a doctor and I'm not really sure how to handle this situation. So I don't want to get involved because I'm not really, I don't know enough about the situation. So I really can't help it all either. Or maybe we think to ourselves, someone else is going to help it. Right? Have you ever heard somebody say, I'm not going to help because someone else will probably come along and they'll just do it. I know someone else is coming behind me and they'll probably help, so I don't need to because someone else is coming. Or maybe we might say, you know what, I've been to church already a few times this week. I've served God already this week, so I don't need to do that anymore because I've served. And maybe you've never said that, but by your actions you've said it. I've already done something good for somebody this week, so I don't need to help because I've already done something good. Maybe this. Maybe those priests and the Levites looked at somebody and said, you know what? I tried to help somebody about 10 years ago like this, and it blew up in my face, so I'm never helping anybody again. I tried this before. I tried to help somebody, and they took advantage of what I gave them, so I'm never helping anybody again. I tried to help them. I tried. And I gave them what they need. I tried to study the Bible, and they did not listen to me, so I'm just never going to have a Bible study with anybody else again because they shut the door in my face. They didn't listen to me. You see how silly that sounds? I wonder why the priest and the Levite passed by. I don't know exactly. Maybe they said, well, I don't have enough money to put him up tonight, so I can't help him. Did you know that helping people doesn't cost anything? It really doesn't. Not just giving them a word of encouragement or a time. It doesn't cost anything. You can help a lot of people. You can make an eternity's difference without spending one dime. You can do it. And these guys, they missed it. They missed it. They missed an opportunity to be the true religious people that they pledged to be. They prided themselves on knowing the law, and they told everybody, and they had a golden opportunity to put the law in practice. And the irony of the story in Luke 10 is that these are the two most religious people that the man who's laying on the side of the road half dead could have encountered. The two most religious people that could have passed by that day, it was those two guys. If you asked the priest and the Levite, do you love God? They would say, oh, yes, we love God. We love God with all of our heart. And on one level, it would have been true. They would have meant it to some degree. They were men who spent their days worshiping God. But it's against that background that their failure in Luke 10 is so great. That they did know God, and they did know the law. And they did worship God, and they did worship the law. They were men who spent their days doing that. They had come from God's presence, literally. They left Jerusalem doing their priestly duties as a priest and the Levite. They were literally in the presence of God. But do you want to know the great failure? They never let God get in them. They never let what they were doing with God and for God change their hearts. It was a ritual and nothing more than that. How many people do you know like that? You might even be here this morning. That's all it is to you. It's just a ritual. It's just what you do because it's Sunday and you go to church. And that's why you're here. And that's good. This is the place you should be. But don't leave here unchanged. Don't let it just be here. I'm here because I have to be. I'm here because this is where I should be. Be here because you want to be. Be here because you get to be. I heard that all my life. Mom, do we have to go to church today? No, you don't have to. You get to. Those guys, they went because they had to. It was their job. And the reason they didn't help that man who was laying half dead on the side of the road is because they viewed their relationship to God as a have to, not a get to. What about you? Seriously, what about you? These were the most religiously hypocritical people that man who was laying half dead on the side of the road could have ever encountered. The people that really could have done something more than anyone. They walked right by him and didn't do anything. But you keep reading in verse number 33, and you read these words, but a Samaritan. But a Samaritan. That just, even that alone is something worth paying attention to, because the Samaritans, they don't do anything for anybody. In fact, everybody turns their noses up at the Samaritans. They avoid the Samaritans because of how wicked and evil and horrid they are. But this is the one that everyone least expects to stop and help. The ones that should have didn't, but the one that nobody thinks would help, they're the ones that stop and do something about it. The Samaritan stopped. And it's fair to point out that the Samaritan probably had as many or more reasons not to stop as the priest and the Levite did. He could have used any of those excuses that they did, but he didn't. There was one thing that kept that Samaritan right beside the man who was half dead, and it was compassion. Verse 33, the Samaritan saw the man lying on the side of the road and was moved with compassion. So then we shift our attention to verses 36 and 37, and we focus on the application. He told me to take as much time as I want, but I won't do that. We'll shift into the application and think together just briefly, and I think to the point of what Jesus was trying to impress on the mind of this individual who asked him this question. When you get to verse number 36, and you focus on the answer to the question, right? Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor? Remember, that's what the guy asked him. Well, who is my neighbor? Jesus, tell me who I don't have to love. And Jesus tells the story about the religious people that should have stopped that didn't, and the one that had no business stopping, he's the one that helps. Jesus says, which of those three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? Jesus said, go and do the same. After he responds, well, it was the one who stopped. It was the one who showed mercy, the one who showed compassion, the one who actually took the time to stop and pay attention to the man on the side of the road. In the beginning, the question was, who is my neighbor? The lawyer wanted limitation. He wanted a loophole, right? Tell me who I don't have to love. Tell me how I can get out of this. But Jesus changes the question. Now, he doesn't do so literally, because Jesus doesn't reword the question in the text and say, no, let me change it. But by the story that Jesus tells to the man and the application that he leaves in the mind and the heart of the man, Jesus changes the question. And I'm making a proposition to you this morning as we go out into our respective lives this week, and we will inevitably encounter people who are on the road to Jericho who definitely have needs. Maybe you can think of someone who should be here today and is not. And for whatever reason, you have reasoned why you shouldn't help them. I'm too busy to help them. They don't want my help. I've tried to help them before and they didn't listen. I don't have the money to do it. I don't have the time to do it. I don't want to do it. Whatever reason, you'll encounter somebody this week that you can help. Okay? How did Jesus change the question that might put us in a good position to do what we were literally born again to do? Jesus changes the question from who is my neighbor to teaching a lesson about a Samaritan who asked the question, whose neighbor am I? That's how it lives, or at least it turns out. He says the Samaritan didn't wonder, okay, who should I love? Is this guy a Samaritan, or is he a Jew, or I don't know. I don't know if I should love him because he's not like me. No, the Samaritan didn't view the question like that. Who is my neighbor? He looked around at himself and said, whose neighbor can I be? Whose neighbor can I be? How can I help this man? How can I be a neighbor to this person? And I think by the story of the Good Samaritan, that's the way that Jesus rewords the question to this expert of the law. He says, who is my neighbor? Jesus says, no. Whose neighbor can you be? Whose neighbor can you be? This week, whose neighbor can you be? Who in your life needs your help? Maybe they do need physical help. Maybe they do need a little bit of money. I do know this, that if you give to them, you give what you have, you give even a little, God can do a lot with a little, and you can't outgive Him. His shovel's bigger than yours. He'll give it back to you. If you can, give. Maybe it's time. Maybe you can give them a time. Maybe there's somebody you can give them a phone call this week. Maybe there's somebody you can write them a card this week. Maybe there's somebody you can just pop in and check on them this week. Maybe you know somebody who's sick or is going through a death in the family. Maybe you can just reach out to them and write them a card or send them a dish of food. Literally, it is so easy to help people who are in need. Really, you just have to do it. It's a shift in perspective of, okay, do they view the same political candidate as me? Do they like LSU or what? In my neck of the woods, are they Alabama or Auburn? And we don't like either one of them, right? But I mean, I guess the reason we get along is because all the Alabama fans hate Auburn more than they hate LSU. So I just fly under the radar. But it's, as funny as it is, I mean, there are people that won't talk to you if LSU beats them in a football game. I'm not kidding. 2 weeks at the congregation where I preached did a man not talk to me. He's since apologized and I forgave him. But I'll tell you what, 2 weeks he didn't talk to me because LSU beat Alabama. Like, it's a big deal to people. And there's dividing lines that people won't do something for someone because something as silly as college football, or their political party candidate, or the color of their skin, or the language that they speak, or maybe even the clothes that they're wearing. Don't be that person. Instead of viewing it as, who is my neighbor? Don't ask that question. Ask the question this week, whose neighbor can I be? How can I show the love of Jesus to someone this week? I think that was the answer that Jesus gave to this man, that he helped him realize, you're right. The person who is blessed, the one who receives more mercy from Jesus, is the one who views himself as a neighbor to all and does and fulfills his Christian responsibility to carry out the love of Jesus. This week, all of us are going to walk the road to Jericho. All of us are going to do it. We're all going to walk and meet somebody who's in need, somebody who we can help, that we can extend the love of Jesus to. My question for you is, whose neighbor are you going to be this week? Whose neighbor are you going to be? How can you make a difference for eternity in someone's life? By just an encouraging word, or maybe a hug, just a phone call or a card or whatever it can be. Whose neighbor can you be this week? Maybe you are a Christian and maybe you think, as we were sort of going through some of those excuses, how trivial and really how silly and ridiculous some of the excuses that we make for not doing what we should do. I mean, you think about 38 people heard her screaming. 38 people heard her screaming. They saw the blood on the ground. They saw Mr. Mosley stabbing her 40 times. They saw, and no one did anything. That is a tragedy. It's a tragedy that no one was moved to help. Let it not be said of God's people that we were not moved to help. Maybe you aren't a Christian. You never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ. Aren't you thankful that Jesus was moved to help? Aren't you thankful, all of us, that Jesus was moved to help? That he didn't sit up there and say, you know what, God, I don't really want to do this. God, I've got other things that you need me to be doing. God, I'm too busy for this. I've got important stuff like creating the world and stuff. I've got things to do, right? I don't have time to go down there and help them. Aren't you thankful he didn't say that? Aren't you thankful he was moved to help? Maybe you need to respond to that type of compassion, an eternal heavenly compassion that supersedes all of the sin that you carry. You can lay it down at his feet today, be washed clean in the blood of Jesus, and have a new life that's motivated to be a neighbor, a real neighbor to those who are in need. If we can help you in any way, we invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.